What's the worst piece of advice or the most unhelpful thing that you've been told as a single? We asked you guys on Instagram, and today we're going to unpack what your responses were in this video. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be responding to the pieces of advice that you've been given that have been bad, or also the unhelpful things that people have said to you as singles. Remember, these are just my thoughts and my opinions on what you have had to send, so if you want to add to the conversation, write it down in the comments below. So the first one is people asking when you're planning on settling down. Definitely can be an awkward thing to ask and even to answer, because it's like I don't know when I'm going to be settling down. I don't have control of that. So I think if you ask someone or you say that to someone, just be mindful that it's not actually usually in the control of that person. A lot of the times people are waiting, but it just hasn't happened yet. And if you say something like, when are you planning to settle down, it makes it feel a bit insensitive, and it can feel a bit judgmental as well, that you're kind of saying between the lines oh, you're behind in life, why aren't you settling down yet? Have you found someone yet? As if I'm hopeless at finding someone. I think often the way something is said is also really important. If someone says to me in a sympathetic way, oh, have you found someone yet? It makes me feel really bad about myself. I kind of feel a bit like a failure, because they're saying this with sympathy towards me. And I think if you're saying stuff like this to people, it's just good to be mindful of how your tone is coming across and the way that you're saying it is portrayed. And another thing that I also recognize is that I actually don't really mind when people ask me that if I'm really close to them, because I know that they genuinely care about me and genuinely want to know for my own kind of well-being. But then there's also people who are just honestly plain nosy, and you're just why are you asking me when you barely even talk to me, or I don't really know you? So I think another thing to be mindful of is you need to assess the level of relationship that you have with someone before you can ask these sort of questions as well. Otherwise it can just seem a little bit intrusive and invasive. Insert story of how the girl stopped looking and then her husband came along. So I definitely, when I first read this, I was wow, this is totally relatable. I think I used to definitely believe this, because I was told this by a few different people, and what I realized is that it's probably not the wisest thing to say, because when you say it, it kind of gives the impression that, God is waiting for you to be completely content in Him before He'll bring someone. And if you're never content, then He'll never bring someone. And on top of that, it also makes it seem like if someone is actually actively looking for someone, it's actually a bad thing, and it can actually lead people to actually just be passive in looking for a spouse as well. So though this actually might be true for a lot of people, because I've seen a lot of testimonies online where they're actually I stopped looking and someone came, it shouldn't be something that's prescriptive, because it's not the same for every person in the journey. And if you kind of say that, then it can lead people to have different expectations, and also when things don't actually happen, then they also feel a sense of failure as well, because they're oh, I stopped looking, but why hasn't it still happened yet? You're not praying enough. Honestly, I think that's just bad theology. It's just if we view God like that, we actually are saying that we think that God will only bless us when we actually do something enough for Him. And God isn't a stingy God. He's not a calculated God, and it turns the relationship that we have with Him into a more transactional one as well. And even though I think it's really important to pray for your spouse, and there's a lot of power in prayer for your spouse, it's not conditional in order for God to kind of bring someone for you. You're not getting any younger. When people say this to me, I'm yeah, I know I'm not getting any younger. Honestly, saying this doesn't really help. It actually only adds pressure, I think, to the people that are actually waiting for a spouse as well. So I think saying something like that isn't really constructive or helpful, and it can actually lead people to start to compromise what they are looking for, and actually to also lower their standards, because they feel if I don't do that, I'm not going to find anyone and I'm going to run out of time. So on the flip side, we have this one which says, you're so young, you still have time, I don't know why you're worried. And I think if you say, I don't know why you're worried, or you shouldn't worry, I feel that also invalidates people's feelings, because whether you're young or old, this is how people feel. It's not really helpful. I think rather than saying just don't worry because you have so much time left, I think the better thing to do is to actually point people back to scripture and try and just give them the reassurance that God has their future secure in his hands, and that he actually is the author of time, and in that they can be secure, and that's why they wouldn't need to worry. You are too picky and you need to lower your standards. This is definitely the response that we got the most on Instagram, and even for myself, like, this is probably the thing that I've heard the most in terms of like advice. And I wouldn't say it's the worst piece of advice, because there is some validity to it. Like, we do need to understand what our standards are based on and what's the criteria we choose a partner. Like, are they based on worldly or godly values? But if they are based on kingdom values, and if we truly are seeking someone with like godly character and based on godly principles, like, it's actually really bad advice to be like, lower your standards or stop being so picky. Because at the end of the day, like, this is the second biggest decision that you ever make aside from following Christ in your life, and you want to make sure it's the right thing. So honestly, my own opinion is that I think it's actually good for people to be picky, just making sure that what you're picking on is based off the right principles and the right standards. And if you're the person who's giving advice to people, I'd actually encourage you to just talk to the person and ask them, like, what are your standards and what are you actually basing your criteria off? Because I know that when I've shared this with people in the past, they've been like, you know what, your list is actually pretty reasonable and you don't need to lower your standards. So I think it's important not to just make assumptions just because someone hasn't found anyone that they're being too picky, and it's actually important to know what their values they're holding to, and also just to listen to them as well. You'll definitely marry one day. I'm sure God will give you the right person. I definitely heard this in another way, being like, you know, God's got someone already for you. And I think even though it comes with the best intentions, it's really important not to say that to people, because you actually don't know. Like, you don't know whether they're going to get married or not, and no one's been promised a spouse, so you can't actually guarantee that. And I think if you say that, it can give people like false expectations and false hope as well. So I think the only appropriate time to really say that is, let's say if you have a prophetic word and you feel led to actually share that with someone, then that's probably a little bit different. But I think in a general sense, like, we shouldn't ever use it as a blanket statement to be like, oh yeah, everyone's gonna be married one day, because that's actually just not true for everyone. Married life isn't all it's cracked up to be. I think people say this when they feel like they need to downplay marriage a little bit to make the person who's single feel a bit better about themselves. But sometimes it just feels like a bit like a pity party, and it's like, I don't need you to feel sorry for me just because, you know, I'm single. And you don't need to like downplay marriage or say it's not as good just because, you know, I really want it and I don't have it. I think while there is probably truth to that statement, like, marriage is probably a lot harder than a lot of us realize, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. It doesn't actually remove that desire, and if anything, it kind of makes people feel like, oh, you're ungrateful for the blessing that you have, which single people are like praying for and earnestly wanting as well. You must not be looking in the right places, or you're not looking hard enough. I think when you say this to someone, it actually just discounts all the efforts that they have done. Like, I know a lot of people who have actually tried really hard to find a life partner, and they haven't just gone to church, but they've also, you know, like joined clubs, like not a doof doof club, but like, you know, clubs like interest clubs. So like judo and like sailing, swimming, and even like going to online dating platforms, and just like going through different avenues. People have actually really tried, and to be like, you haven't really looked hard enough, it's not really a nice thing or encouraging thing to say. Try visiting other churches to meet people. I actually don't think this is necessarily bad advice, but I don't think this advice really should apply to everyone, because at the end of the day, I actually think that it really depends on your motivations and also where you are in terms of like inward security. So for example, earlier this year, I actually tried doing this, and I thought I was in a good place, but then as I was doing this, I realized I was losing my trust in God, because I was trying to control the situation and manipulate and take things into my own hands, rather than be like, God, I know that you have or that you will provide someone for me if it's your will. So I think if that person isn't actually in that place of security, like, it's actually a bit dangerous to be like, oh, you should try and go to different churches, because it can actually make them start to want to control the situation more than trusting God. Maybe God's calling you to be single. I mean, maybe he is, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's appropriate for anyone else to tell other people that unless they actually have like spiritual authority, because it's a really personal and really sensitive thing to talk about. And I truly believe that if God is actually calling them into singleness, like, God will actually tell that person to, like, he will speak to them, and that's actually something that's more between them and God rather than you and them. If there's anything that I've learned from these responses, it's that we need to learn how to discern good advice from bad advice. We need to understand who is actually telling us What is their fruit like in their life, and does it most importantly align with scripture? And if you're the one giving advice to people, remember to speak with truth and with kindness. In Proverbs 16:24 it says, "Kind words are like honey, sweet to the soul and healthy for the body." And if someone actually is the one giving you advice and they give you the wrong advice, I encourage you to extend grace to them and actually correct them in a loving way as well. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you like it and subscribe to Salt's YouTube channel for more videos on singleness, dating and relationships.